I spent exactly 12 hours in my kitchen before the sun even peeked over the horizon on Christmas morning. You have to understand that for people like me, the effort is the point. I am the one who remembers the birthdays, the one who sends the flowers when a distant cousin gets a promotion, and the one who ensures my mother's table never looks empty. It is a role I stepped into so long ago that I forgot it was optional. My mother likes to play the part of the fragile matriarch, the delicate woman who just cannot manage the heavy lifting anymore. So I lift. I lift the costs, the labor, and the emotional weight of keeping a fractured family under one roof for a single afternoon. The centerpiece of this year was a heritage turkey I had ordered 3 months in advance. It cost me nearly $200 just for the bird itself, a beautiful free-range specimen that I had been dry brining with organic herbs and sea salt for 2 days. I don't say this to brag about the money, though the money matters. I say it because it represents the level of care I poured into a woman who usually gives me nothing but a list of grievances. I wanted this to be perfect. I wanted to look at her across the table and see, just for once, a glimmer of genuine gratitude, rather than the usual expectation that I am simply a service provider in her life. I arrived at her house 4 hours early. My car was packed so tightly with gourmet sides that I could barely see out of the rearview mirror. I brought the roasted root vegetables drizzled in expensive Manuka honey, the sourdough stuffing I made from scratch using a starter I had tended for weeks, and 3 different types of pies because I knew she'd complain if she didn't have options. As I carried the heavy crates into her kitchen, she didn't even look up from her tea. She just gestured toward the stove with a limp hand, complaining that the house felt a bit chilly and asking if I had remembered to bring the specific wine she liked. I had, of course. I had spent nearly $800 on this single meal. I was the saint of the season, a title I wore like a heavy lead vest. The kitchen soon filled with the scent of sage, rosemary, and the rich, golden aroma of the bird roasting to a perfect mahogany crisp. I spent the afternoon scrubbing her floors, polishing her silverware, and setting a table that looked like it belonged in a high-end magazine. I did it all while she sat in the living room, scrolling through her phone and sighing about how lonely the holidays can be for a widow. I reminded her that I was right there, that I had been there every weekend for a month helping her get ready. But my presence never seemed to count as company. It was just a given. I was the reliable one. I was the one who could be pushed because I never pushed back. By 4 o'clock, the table was a masterpiece. The turkey was resting, glistening under the kitchen lights, and the house smelled like a dream. I felt a rare sense of pride. I had done my duty, and I had done it with a level of excellence that no one could fault. I poured myself a small glass of wine, finally sitting down for a second to catch my breath before the rest of the guests arrived. My back ached, and my hands were stained with the juices of a dozen vegetables, but I thought it was worth it. I thought I was buying a moment of peace. The doorbell rang, a sharp, intrusive sound that cut through the soft holiday music playing in the background. I started to get up, assuming it was my aunt or perhaps a neighbor, but my mother moved with a sudden, surprising burst of energy. She smoothed her hair, a strange, nervous smile flickering across her face that I didn't quite recognize. She walked toward the foyer, pausing just long enough to look back at me with a look that wasn't quite guilt, but something much more calculated. She adjusted her cardigan and whispered that she hoped I could be a big person today. She reached for the brass handle and turned it, opening the door to the cold winter air. She looked at me and said, "Oh, I forgot to mention I invited a special guest to help us heal." The man standing on the threshold was not a stranger, but he was the last person on earth who should have been allowed to breathe the same air as me, let alone enter my sanctuary. It was Greg. He stood there with that same arrogant, half-crooked smirk that used to make me feel safe but now made my skin crawl with a visceral physical heat. He was holding a cheap bottle of grocery store sparkling cider, looking at me as if he hadn't spent 18 months systematically dismantling my life before vanishing into the shadows of his own cowardice. The last time I had seen him was in a courtroom, and before that it was the night I found out he hadn't just been cheating with a coworker, but had been using my social security number to open lines of credit to fund their weekend getaways. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, shaking the snow off his coat onto the rug I had vacuumed only an hour prior. My mother stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm with a terrifyingly maternal warmth. I felt the air leave my lungs. The betrayal wasn't just his presence. It was the realization that my mother had been in contact with him behind my back. She knew everything. She knew about the late-night panic attacks, the thousands of dollars in legal fees I paid to clear my name, and the way I had to rebuild my credit from the literal ash he left behind. She had held me while I cried, and now she was holding the hand of the man who caused the tears. I didn't scream. I didn't even move. I just stood in the center of the kitchen, clutching my wine glass so hard I thought the stem might snap. I asked her why he was here. My voice was a flat, dead thing, but she didn't flinch. She just waved her hand dismissively, as if my trauma was a minor social inconvenience she was tired of hearing about. She told me that it was Christmas, a time for forgiveness and new beginnings. She said that Greg had reached out to her months ago, expressing how much he regretted his mistakes, and that she had decided he deserved a seat at the table. To her, he wasn't the man who stole my identity and my dignity. He was just a poor boy who had lost his way. The entitlement in her voice was a physical weight. She looked at the stunning spread I had prepared, the bird that cost more than her monthly utility bill, the sides that took days of my life, and she spoke to me as if I were a petulant child for being upset. She told me to stop being so dramatic and to go get another plate from the cabinet. When I hesitated, Greg had the audacity to chime in, saying he really hoped we could just put the past behind us for one night because he had really missed my cooking. He said it with a wink, a disgusting familiar gesture that proved he felt entirely insulated by my mother's protection. I looked at my mother and told her that he needed to leave. I reminded her specifically that he was a thief and a liar. Her face hardened instantly. The fragile act vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp bitterness. She told me that this was her house, and she would decide who was family and who wasn't. She said that Greg had been more of a son to her lately than I had been a daughter, simply because he called to check on her while I was too busy working the 3 jobs I needed to pay off the debts he left me. It was a calculated strike, a way to frame my labor as a failure and his manipulation as a virtue. The room felt smaller. The smell of the rosemary and sage, which had been so comforting moments ago, now felt cloying and sickly sweet. I looked at the table I had labored over, the expensive china gleaming under the soft yellow light, and the centerpiece turkey that was meant to be a symbol of my love and resilience. I looked at the table I paid for, the food I cooked, and realized they expected me to serve the man who destroyed me. A strange, cold clarity washed over me in that moment. It wasn't the kind of heat that makes you see red. It was the kind of absolute zero that makes everything perfectly still. I watched Greg hang his coat on the rack I had installed for my mother last spring, and I watched my mother pull out the heavy oak chair at the head of the table, the one reserved for the guest of honor. They were already moving as if I were invisible, a ghost who had finished her haunting and was now expected to fade into the kitchen to start carving. I didn't say a word. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a breakdown or the dramatic exit they could later use to paint me as the unstable one. I simply walked back into the kitchen. My movements were fluid and methodical. I didn't look at the sink full of dishes I had scrubbed or the piles of vegetable peelings that represented hours of my life. I reached for the thick, quilted oven mitts I had brought from my own home. I pulled them on, feeling the familiar weight of the fabric against my palms. I approached the counter where the heritage turkey sat. It was beautiful, a golden brown masterpiece resting in a heavy stainless steel roasting pan. I could hear them in the dining room. Greg was laughing, telling some anecdote about his new job, and my mother was tittering like a schoolgirl, her voice light and carefree in a way it never was when it was just the two of us. I gripped the handles of the roasting pan. It was heavy, nearly 25 pounds of meat and cast iron, but I lifted it with a strength I didn't know I possessed. I walked through the dining room toward the front door. The silence hit the room like a physical blow. Greg's laugh cut off mid-breath. My mother's fork clattered against her plate, the sound ringing out in the sudden quiet. She stood up, her face twisting into a mask of pure confusion. She asked me what on earth I thought I was doing. I didn't stop. I kicked the doorstop away and headed for the foyer. She began to scramble after me, her voice rising into that shrill, panicked register she used whenever she lost control of a situation. She told me I was being ridiculous. She shouted that I couldn't just take the main course. Greg stood in the archway, looking more annoyed than guilty, and told me to grow up and stop ruining Christmas over a joke. That was what he called it. A joke. My life, my credit, and my safety were just punchlines to them. I reached the front door and turned back just once. I told them that since Greg was such a son to her, he could provide the miracle of the loaves and fishes, because they weren't getting a single bite of my labor. My mother screamed that I was a monster, that I was selfish, and that I was destroying the family over a piece of meat. I didn't answer. I stepped out into the biting cold, the steam from the turkey rising up into the night air like a ghost. I slid the roasting pan onto the passenger floorboard of my car, the scent of rosemary filling the small cabin. As I drove away with the steam fogging my windows, I realized the turkey wasn't the only thing they'd been stealing from me for years. The silence of my apartment felt heavy, a stark contrast to the performative warmth I had left behind. I sat at my small kitchen table, still wearing my winter coat, with the roasting pan sitting directly on the placemat. I didn't bother with a plate. I didn't bother with a napkin. I just grabbed a fork and ate a piece of the turkey I had spent days preparing. It was perfect, moist, seasoned exactly right, and entirely mine. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't waiting for someone to criticize the salt levels or ask why the gravy wasn't thicker. I was eating the literal fruits of my labor, and for a few minutes, the only sound was the hum of my refrigerator. Then the vibration started. My phone, resting face down on the granite, began to buzz with a relentless, rhythmic aggression. I didn't pick it up at first. I knew what was coming. I knew the machinery of a toxic family was already grinding into gear, preparing to crush the person who dared to disrupt the status quo. When I finally flipped the screen over, the notifications were already stacking up like a digital pile of stones meant for a stoning. The first wave was the concerned mother phase. There was a text from 5:12 p.m. "Sweetie, please come back." We were all just shocked. "Greg is so sorry if he upset you. Don't let your temper ruin our holiday." I could almost hear her voice, the faux tremor, the way she frames my boundaries as a temper. 2 minutes later, another one. "The guests are arriving and there's nothing on the table. You're embarrassing me. Just bring the bird back and we can forget this happened." The transition was starting. The mask of the frail mother was slipping because her social standing was at risk. By 5:30 p.m., the tone shifted from pleading to the monster phase. My brother, who hadn't checked in on me once since my identity theft ordeal, sent a wall of text. "What is wrong with you? Mom is in tears. You left an old woman with no food on Christmas because you want to be petty about an ex? Get over yourself and bring the food back now. You're acting like a sociopath." I read the words "get over yourself" and felt a cold iron wall snap into place behind my eyes. These people didn't care that Greg had crippled me financially. They cared that their dinner was delayed. I scrolled further, watching the family group chat erupt. My Aunt Martha chimed in. "I always knew you had a mean streak, but stealing dinner from your own mother is a new low." We are all sitting here in shock. I hope that turkey tastes like ashes. It was fascinating in a clinical sort of way to see how quickly a lifetime of giving was erased by one single act of taking back. I had paid for her medications, her property taxes, and her groceries for 3 years, but because I took back a bird I bought and cooked, I was the villain of the century. The messages became more frequent, a barrage of entitlement disguised as moral outrage. Greg even had the nerve to send a direct message. "Hey, I know we have history, but this is low even for you. Your mom is hyperventilating. Just bring the food and I'll leave if it makes you feel better." I knew him well enough to know he had no intention of leaving. He was enjoying this. He was watching the family tear me apart and he didn't have to lift a finger. I was about to turn the phone off and finish my meal in peace when a private message popped up from my younger cousin, Sarah. Sarah was the only one who usually stayed out of the drama, the only one who saw the family for what it really was. Her message made the blood in my veins turn to ice. It wasn't an insult. It was a warning. She wrote, "Hey, I'm not there yet, but I just saw what Mom posted on Facebook and the family email thread. You need to be careful. Mom is telling everyone you had a total breakdown, that you physically attacked Greg in the kitchen, and then ran off with all the food to spite her." A text from a cousin reveals that Mom told everyone the narrator attacked Greg before stealing the food. The light in my home office was a single harsh desk lamp that cast long, skeletal shadows against the walls. I had been sitting there for 3 hours, surrounded by stacks of paper that looked like a mountain of white snow. I had gone back to the very beginning, to the first semester of Maya's freshman year. and I was meticulously tracing every dollar that had ever left my account and entered hers. At first, it was a dull ache of numbers: the tuition payments, the rent for her safe apartment, the meal plans. But as I dug deeper into the itemized bank statements and the archived Venmo descriptions, the ache turned into a searing white-hot rage. I began to see the patterns I had been too tired and too blinded by sisterly love to notice before. I looked at the emergency Ubers I had paid for, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single weekend. Maya had told me she was taking them because the campus shuttles were unreliable, and she didn't feel safe walking to the library at night. I cross-referenced the timestamps. These weren't rides to the library. They were 2 a.m. pickups from the city's most expensive nightclub districts, dropping her off at luxury hotels and private residences miles away from her dorm. I had been paying for her party lifestyle under the guise of her physical safety. Then there were the study retreats. Every spring, Maya would call me in a panic, claiming her honors seminar required a mandatory weekend at a mountain resort or a coastal conference center to focus on deep research. I had squeezed my budget until it bled to send her those $500 every March. I pulled up her old, archived social media posts from those dates, the ones she'd forgotten to hide from me back then. There were no books. There was no research. There were only photos of her in designer bikinis, sipping cocktails on a yacht, surrounded by people who looked like they had never worked a day in their lives. She had used my sweat to buy her way into their circle. The most disgusting discovery, however, came when I looked at the lab fees. For 4 years, Maya had sent me screenshots of invoices from the university for specialized equipment, high-end software licenses, and laboratory materials. They were always for odd amounts: $842.15 here, $1,200.50 there. I had paid them without question because I didn't want her to fall behind. But as I looked at the scanned PDF she had sent me 2 years ago, I noticed a slight blur around the university logo. I zoomed in until the pixels broke apart. She had forged them. She had used a basic editing program to overlay the school's header onto receipts from high-end boutiques and luxury department stores. While I was wearing shoes with holes in the soles, she was using lab fees to build a wardrobe of European silk and Italian leather. I felt like an archaeologist uncovering the ruins of my own life. I had been so proud of her academic expenses, bragging to my coworkers about how smart my sister was and how demanding her curriculum must be. In reality, I was just a private equity fund for a con artist who shared my DNA. I felt a sense of profound nausea as I added up the miscellaneous category. It wasn't just a few $100s of waste. It was a systematic, calculated extraction of wealth. She hadn't been a student. She had been a parasite with a very sophisticated filing system. But the final blow didn't come from the clothes or the clubs. It came from a series of monthly transfers I had overlooked for years. Every time I sent her rent money, she would claim the landlord had raised the utility fee or the building insurance. I would send the extra $50 or $100 feeling bad for her. I started tracking those overages. They didn't go to a landlord. They went to a third-party fintech app, a digital wallet I didn't recognize. I stayed up until the sun began to bleed through the blinds, tracing the digital breadcrumbs through layers of accounts she thought I'd never find. I found a $12,000 discrepancy. She hadn't just been taking my money. She'd been laundering it into a secret savings account for her new life away from me. I didn't sleep that night. The caffeine in my system had long since stopped being a stimulant and had become a structural part of my nervous system. My eyes were burning, but my mind was a cold, calculating machine. I opened a professional invoicing template on my laptop, the kind used by high-end consulting firms, the very world Maya so desperately wanted to inhabit. I titled it Formal and Final Statement of Unresolved Educational and Living Expenses. I started from the first wire transfer in August 4 years ago. I didn't just list the big numbers. I listed everything. I listed the $14.99 for the graphing calculator she said she lost, the $200 for the emergency dental work that turned out to be professional teeth whitening, and the $4,000 for the academic internship in London that was actually a 6-day shopping spree with her sorority sisters. I applied a standard 5% annual interest rate, the kind a bank would charge for a personal loan. I wasn't being cruel, I was being a professional. As the spreadsheet calculated the totals, the number at the bottom of the screen made my breath hitch. $284,000. $500.62. That was the price of my sister's Ivy League soul. That was the cost of my wasted decade. To make the impact hit home, I created a second page titled Opportunity Cost Analysis. This was the section that hurt me the most to type. I used real market data to show what that money would have become if I had invested it in a simple index fund. I showed the down payment on a 4-bedroom house in a quiet suburb. I showed the retirement account that would have allowed me to stop working 2 jobs. I even included a line for a 911 Carrera, just to show her the level of luxury I had sacrificed so she could play act as an aristocrat. The contrast was staggering. On one side of the ledger there was a life of security, comfort, and a sports car. On the other side, under the heading Actualized Return on Investment, I typed 3 words. 1 block number. I attached every forged lab fee invoice I had discovered in Phase 1. I attached the screenshots of her Instagram posts from the study retreats, alongside the bank statements showing me paying for her hotels. I wanted the evidence to be undeniable. I wanted it to be a forensic reconstruction of a 4-year heist. I didn't just send it to Maya. I knew her well enough to know she would just delete it and call me crazy. I added my parents to the recipient list. They needed to see exactly how much of my life they had helped their star daughter consume. Then I took the most important step. I added our family's estate lawyer, Mr. Henderson, to the CC line. He was a dry, meticulous man who had handled our grandfather's will, and had always treated me with a shred of respect that my parents lacked. By including him, I wasn't just venting. I was creating a legal record. I was served notice that this was no longer a family matter. It was a debt. I sat there with my finger hovering over the mouse, the blue light of the screen making my skin look ghostly. I thought about the girl Maya used to be, the one who cried when she skinned her knee and ran to me for a bandage. I realized that girl was gone, or maybe she never existed. Maybe she was just a character she played until she found a better script. I felt a strange sense of mourning, not for her, but for the person I could have been if I hadn't spent my youth as a human ATM. I wasn't the stable one. I was the exploited one. And the stable was officially empty. I hit send. The whoosh sound of the outgoing email felt like a guillotine blade dropping. It was a clean, sharp severance. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my hands finally still. I expected silence. I expected her to wait until morning to formulate a plan with our parents, to find a way to spin this as me being unstable or jealous. I thought I had hours of peace ahead of me. I thought the digital blackout I had initiated earlier would keep her at bay until she could find a Wi-Fi signal to beg for. I was wrong. Maya was always resourceful when her status was threatened. She must have been using our parents' phones or a hotel landline, or perhaps she had frantically bought a prepaid burner the moment her service cut out. I hadn't even finished my glass of water when the vibration started. My phone, which had been a silent weight in my pocket all day, began to dance across the granite countertop. The screen stayed dark, showing no name, no photo, just the words that every victim of a toxic family knows by heart. The email was sent at 2 a.m. By 2:05 a.m., my blocked phone started screaming with no caller ID pings. The banging on my front door started at 6 in the morning. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of someone who believed they owned the wood they were trying to splinter. I didn't even have to look through the peephole to know who it was. The shrill, rhythmic screeching of my mother's voice was already bleeding through the frame. When I opened the door, I didn't see parents who were worried about a fractured family. I saw 2 people in a state of pure, frantic panic, because their golden ticket had just been hit with a reality check. My father didn't even say hello. He pushed his way into the entryway, waving a printed copy of my invoice in the air like it was a declaration of war. He screamed that I was a traitor, that I was trying to sabotage Maya's future before it even started. My mother stood behind him, her face twisted into a mask of pure indignation. She told me that Maya had just landed a junior associate position at a prestigious global consulting firm, and that my stunt with the lawyer could trigger a red flag on her background check. They weren't angry that Maya had betrayed me. They were terrified that her betrayal wouldn't be profitable anymore. I stood there, leaning against the wall with my arms crossed, feeling a strange, detached coldness. I asked them plainly if they knew she was going to block me. My mother didn't even have the decency to lie. She snapped at me, saying that Maya needed a clean break from the burden of her childhood, and that I should have known she would eventually outgrow my level of lifestyle. They admitted, right there in my hallway, that they had sat in the limo and watched her block my number, nodding in agreement that it was time for her to move into her new circle, without her bitter older sister dragging her down. They saw my 4 years of labor as a service fee that had simply expired. The volume escalated until the walls seemed to vibrate. My father started making threats, telling me he'd tell everyone in our hometown that I was a thief and a liar if I didn't retract the email to the lawyer. That's when the heavy shadow appeared on my porch. My neighbor Miller is a retired police sergeant who doesn't like noise, and he likes bullies even less. He stepped into the doorway, his massive frame blocking the morning light. He didn't say a word at first. He just held up his phone, the red recording light glowing like a warning beacon. He calmly informed my parents that they were currently on private property, making documented threats of extortion and harassment. The shift in the room was instantaneous. My father's bravado evaporated. He knew Miller, and he knew Miller wasn't a family friend who would keep secrets. Miller told them they had 60 seconds to walk to their car before he called the precinct to have them trespassed. He stood there like a stone wall, a third-party witness to the toxicity I had lived with for decades. It was the first time in my life someone had stood between me and their entitlement. My parents backed away, but my mother couldn't help herself. As she reached the sidewalk, she turned back, her voice cracking with a venom I'll never forget. She screamed that I was nothing but a bank to them, a tool that had outlived its usefulness, and that I was dead to the family for asking to be paid back for love. I watched them drive away, their taillights disappearing around the corner. I felt a weight lift, but it wasn't the weight of the debt, it was the weight of the relationship. If I was just a bank, then it was time to stop acting like a sister and start acting like a creditor. Banks don't care about big nights or new circles. Banks care about their principal and their interest. My mom screamed that I was nothing but a bank. So I decided to act like a bank and start the foreclosure. I spent the next morning in a glass-walled office that overlooked the city, sitting across from a man named Marcus Thorne. He wasn't the family's estate lawyer. He was a specialist in predatory debt and contract litigation. I had brought 3 thick binders filled with every digital interaction I'd had with Maya over the last 4 years. My parents always assumed I was the stable one because I was boring, but the truth was I was stable because I was meticulous. Every time Maya had asked for money, I had made sure the paper trail was clear. I showed Marcus a text from her sophomore year where she wrote, "Please just loan me the $4,000 for the housing deposit. I'll pay you back once I'm settled in my career." I showed him the emails where I explicitly stated, "This is an advance on your future earnings, not a gift," and her typed responses of, "I know, I'm so grateful, you're my lifesaver." Marcus flipped through the pages with a neutral expression that slowly sharpened into a predatory grin. He explained that in the eyes of the law, the intent of the parties at the time of the transfer is what defines a gift versus a loan. Maya had spent 4 years creating a written record of indebtedness. She had been so focused on the short-term goal of getting the cash that she had signed her own financial death warrant in blue iMessage bubbles. Marcus looked at the forged lab fee invoices I had uncovered and shook his head. He told me that this wasn't just a civil matter of unpaid loans. This was active fraud. By misrepresenting university expenses to solicit funds, she had crossed a line that turned a family dispute into a potential criminal complaint. He didn't suggest we sue my parents. He suggested we go straight for the jugular. We drafted a formal demand for payment, a document that vibrated with legal authority. It didn't just ask for the money back. It laid out the forensic evidence of her fraud and the itemized list of her broken promises. But the masterstroke wasn't the letter itself. It was where we sent it. Marcus knew the firm Maya had bragged about joining. It was a global powerhouse that handled billion-dollar accounts, the kind of place that treats its reputation like a religion. They didn't just hire stars. They hired people with impeccable integrity. We sent the demand letter via a specialized courier directly to the firm's general counsel and her prospective department head. We weren't just asking for my $284,500.62. We were providing them with a courtesy disclosure regarding the character of their newest associate. We included the evidence of the forged university documents she had used to swindle her own sister. Marcus explained that most high-level employment contracts in that tier of the corporate world have very specific language regarding the behavior of their employees, even outside of the office. They couldn't afford to have a documented fraudster on their payroll, especially one whose first act of independence was to default on a $250,000 family debt. I felt a cold surge of vindication as I watched Marcus sign his name to the cover letter. I wasn't just chasing a check anymore. I was dismantling the pedestal my parents had built for her. The firm she worked for had a moral turpitude clause in their contract, and I was about to show them exactly who they hired. The silence that followed the delivery of those legal documents was the loudest thing I had ever heard. For 48 hours the world was still. Then the collapse happened all at once, like a skyscraper with a hollow foundation finally meeting a gust of wind. I received a short clipped email from Marcus Thorne. He had been contacted by the HR director at the firm. They didn't even wait to start an internal investigation. In the high-stakes world of global consulting, a credible accusation of financial forgery is a terminal diagnosis. They had rescinded Maya's offer effective immediately. They didn't want the liability. They didn't want the drama. They simply moved on to the next Ivy League graduate who didn't come with $250,000 of baggage and a paper trail of fraud. The shockwaves hit my parents next. They had spent years telling everyone at the country club that Maya was their retirement plan, bragging about the six-figure starting salary that was supposed to keep them in the lifestyle they felt they deserved. They had even taken out a high-interest bridge loan to cover the deposit on a luxury condo near Maya's new office, fully expecting her to take over the payments the moment her first bonus hit. Without that job, the loan became a noose. The house of cards they had built using my life as the table was folding. Then came the phone call. I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset when my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I knew instinctively it was her. I answered without saying a word. The sound on the other end was a ragged, ugly sobbing. It wasn't the polished, delicate crying she used when she wanted a new handbag. It was the sound of a person who had realized the exit doors were locked and the building was on fire. Maya was hysterical. She kept gasping for air, telling me that the firm had treated her like a criminal. She said they had escorted her out of her orientation session in front of everyone. She begged me to call Marcus and tell him it was all a big misunderstanding. She actually had the nerve to say that we were family, and that I was destroying her life over a little bit of money. I listened to her for a full 3 minutes. I listened to her talk about how hard she had worked for that degree, how much the prestige meant to her, and how our parents were going to lose everything if I didn't fix this. She never once said she was sorry for blocking me. She never once acknowledged the years I spent eating salt and grease so she could eat truffles. Even in her total defeat, her only concern was the optics of her failure. She was still trying to use me to solve a problem she had created with her own arrogance. She spoke to me as if I were a malfunctioning tool that just needed a little bit of grease to start working again. When she finally paused to catch her breath, waiting for me to comfort her, waiting for the stable sister to cave in and save the day, I felt absolutely nothing. The saint in me had died on the pavement outside that stadium, and the bank had no interest in subprime borrowers. I remembered her telling me to leave the restaurant before the manager kicked out the trash. I remembered the cold look in her eyes when she walked past my bouquet. "I don't think you understand," I said, my voice as flat and emotionless as a dial tone. "I'm not your sister anymore. I'm your largest creditor. And since you're currently unemployed, I suggest you start looking for a way to liquidate your assets." She started to scream then, a high-pitched, vibrating sound of pure entitlement. She called me a monster. She called me a failure. She told me that I would always be the boring one, and that no amount of money would ever make me as special as she was. She told me I was dead to her and that I would die alone. I didn't wait for her to finish. I didn't need to hear the end of a script I had already rewritten. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air and spoke 4 words into the receiver. "New phone, who's this?" I hung up and blocked the new number before the screen could even dim. I felt a surge of energy, a lightness in my chest that had been missing since I was 18 years old. She tried to play the sister card one last time, but I had one more receipt she didn't know I had. I didn't want to spend the next 10 years of my life in a courtroom staring at the people who had drained me dry. I knew that chasing the full amount personally would mean staying tethered to their chaos, and my peace was worth more than the remaining balance. So, I did the one thing that would ensure Maya felt my presence every single day without me ever having to speak her name again. I bundled the entire debt, the interest, and the documented evidence of fraud, and I sold it to a high-aggression third-party collection agency. I only got a fraction of the total value in cash, but that wasn't the point. The point was that I transferred the account to people who don't care about family ties or Ivy League feelings. Now, instead of a sister she can ignore, she has a rotation of debt collectors who will follow her credit score like a shadow for the next decade. Every time she tries to rent an apartment, apply for a credit card, or sign a new employment contract, my name will be there in the fine print of her failure. With the payout from the debt sale and the $25,000 check I never gave her, I finally did something for myself. I bought a modest, sun-drenched condo 2 towns over. It's small, but every square inch belongs to me. There is no room for a star to crash on the couch, and there are no extra bedrooms for parents who view me as a retirement fund. I changed my number, deleted my old social media, and went completely dark. For the first time in my adult life, I wake up and my money is still in my bank account. The molar that I ignored for a year has been fixed. I wear shoes that don't let the rain in. I realize that the greatest lie I was ever told was that family is a blank check. It isn't. Investment is for the stock market, not for people who see you as an ATM. I'm finally living for me. But wait until you hear what happened when my parents tried to sue me for elderly abandonment. After realizing Maya couldn't pay their mortgage,